thank you for joining us today for a little book of Zen healing, Japanese rituals for beauty, harmony, and love. I am your Zoom host, Helena, employee of San Francisco Zen Center, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thanks for making time to be with us. So I'm just going to do a little introduction. So yeah, I'd like to introduce Konshin Ruth Ozeki. She is a really acclaimed novelist and filmmaker. She has been lauded for her ability to integrate science, technology, religion, and environmental politics, global pop culture into her voice and the work that she does. She has award-winning books, The Book of Form and Emptiness, A Tale for the Time Being, All Over Creation, and My Year of Meats. And she has a memoir called The Face, A Time Code, and a documentary film, Having the Bones. She just recently got Dharma transmission from Norman Fisher this year, and she practices with Everyday Zen Foundation and the Brooklyn Zen Center. And next we have Paula Arai, and she is author as well. She has a doctorate in Buddhist studies from Harvard, and she uses storytelling as a medium for her transformative healing that she researches. So her books include The Little Book of Zen Healing, Japanese Rituals for Beauty, Harmony, and Love, Painting Enlightenment, Healing Visions of the Heart Sutra. And she's also a co-editor for the Harvard Handbook of Buddhist Practice. So yes, I am so honored to be able to introduce them. And without further ado, I will hand it to Ruth.
Thank you so much, Helena, and welcome to everyone. It's so nice to see familiar faces. So thank you for coming today. And Paula, I'm just so happy to have this chance to speak with you again. I mean, we always have so much fun when we talk. So if it's okay, I'd like to just start with a little bit of my own gratitude and to give a little background. You know, I first read Paula's very first book, Women Living Zen, plugging it here. It's Japanese Soto Zen Buddhist Nuns. And I must have read it in the early 2000s, shortly after it came out, because I think it was published in 1998 or 1999, something like that. Yeah. And I remember being absolutely blown away by it. And in fact, I was just looking back through my emails, and I found a very excited exchange between me and Florence Kaplow, who is here today. And we were both talking about how completely blown away we were by this book. I think it was the first time that I had ever seen women's lives, women's monastic lives portrayed. And of course, it's an ethnography. And so it was just so rich with detail. It's a really brilliant ethnography of the Japanese nunnery, the Aichi Senmon Nisodo in Nagoya. And Paula, you lived there and studied there with the nuns for years. And, reading this book, this was really, I look at it now and look through it now, and I realize that this was the book that planted the seed for this character, the character of Old Jiko, right, in my novel, A Tale for the Time Being. So it really was, reading this book and thinking about and sort of visualizing the lives that you studied it sort of grew into the character of this 104-year-old Soto Zen Buddhist nun. I read the book several times, and I seem to do this with all of your books, but you can see, the number of bookmarks that I have in it. And just, I guess it was in 2012, I think, I emailed you out of the blue and asked you if you would advise me on the details, the ritual details in the book. And you did, and we had this wonderful, wonderful Skype call that I remember being so excited about it afterwards. And then I went back to the manuscript and wrote and tried to incorporate all that I'd learned into the book. So So that was really incredible. And then shortly after that, you wrote Bringing Zen Home, the healing heart of Japanese women's rituals, which was another brilliant ethnography. And this time it was of Japanese Buddhist lay women's ritual lives. And I'm saying, of course, you know all of this because you wrote the book, but I just wanted to give people who were here a kind of sense of the scale and the scope of your work. After that, I think the next book was Painting Enlightenment, which is just an incredible book about it's called Painting Enlightenment, Healing Visions of the Heart Sutra, the Buddhist art of Iwasaki Tsuneo. And I have one of his prints right here. And it's, again, just this beautiful book about this Zen artist and biologist, Iwasaki Sensei. And then so that's a very different kind of book. And then there's the Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Practice, which is a very scholarly work. And now we're at the Little Book of Zen Healing, once again, with many, many bookmarks in it. So I guess what I wanted to start with was, just by saying that in academia, there's always been a kind of rigid line drawn between Buddhist scholarship on one hand and Buddhist practice on the other. And traditionally, Western Buddhist scholars, can study Buddhism, but they don't tend to practice it. Or if they do practice it, they kind of keep it secret, like it, in the closet. Somehow, though, in your work, and what I love about your work is the way that you're able to move so fluidly back and forth and cross that line. And I think in the Little Book of Zen Healing, it seems to me anyway, that you've really broken new ground here. It's a beautifully intimate and personal book. And I just was hoping that you could start us off by talking a little bit about how it came to be.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, kind of like watching a movie,
Exactly, right.
Oh.
I
I'd
did
like
that.
to hear. Yeah. So in taking the nuns seriously, when I started my work, I was counseled to keep my distance so I don't contaminate my data. And I knew when I was being told that wasn't going to work. But then when I actually went, it became so clear that if I kept my distance, the women would keep their distance. And as much as I opened up to my shortcomings, my vulnerabilities, that was as much as they opened up to me. And so this notion of who's the observer, who's the subject, it became so clear that this Western view of what research involves was based on this atomistic sense of self. And it didn't work in terms of researching these women. And so I pushed the boundaries, and it's been a journey. It's not always been accepted by the field of Buddhist studies. But that Oxford volume that you mentioned, it's a 670-page tome that I think kind of shifts the discourse, where the body and emotions become part of the view of the Buddhist tradition, that that I see it now as the lens you use to look affects what you're going to see. And so to open the lens up to allow more people in, let the ghosts in, the spirits in, the grandmothers in, that then we get to see the richness of the Buddhist tradition. So the very thing we're trying to study, if we keep the lens narrow, we don't see it. And in working with healing, you're asking people to expose the most painful experiences in their life, because healing is all about facing the hardships. And so to study that required me to examine myself. And then that opened up the field, and the floodgates opened up. They let me into their hearts. And so during the early phase of the pandemic, there's an opera director, Peter Sellers, who I called me up, and I was like, really? Like, is this a crank call? We started talking. I realized, no, this is not a crank call. And he said that Bringing Zen Home got him through the first summer of the pandemic. This is August of 2020. And I'm like, what? How? And he said, Painting Enlightenment is a book I can give away all day long, but Bringing Zen Home, I want to give away, but nobody will read it because it's too academic. And I was thinking, but I tried to make all those stories accessible. And being, such a successful opera director, I thought he knows something about how to reach an audience. So I decided to listen to him and thought, okay, with the pandemic, with so many deaths and other things happening in the political world, everything looked quite dire from inside my home looking out during that period. So I thought, okay, this is what I do. I'm grateful for all the people on the front lines, but I don't have that skill set. So from the safety of my dining room table, I worked on this little book of Zen healing book, and tried to communicate with all the people who were out there suffering. And so I thought, unlike I did with my other books, I always wanted to reach people. I mean, that's the whole point of doing all this. But what shifted in me was I saw these people as my friends, that the only way I could open up to the depth that I think the material demanded was to imagine talking with friends. And so that was in the context of the pandemic and the politics that we were living through and continue to live through. I wanted to connect with people at a deep, authentic level. And so I exposed myself more than I, sometimes wondered if it was, I would regret it, but I don't. It's the unvarnished me that, yeah.
It really comes across. It feels that way. It feels like a conversation, or a kind of invitation into a way of being with grief, being with illness, being with life, right? And I was surprised, because it was not surprised exactly. I was drawn in by the intimacy of it. It really felt like this beautiful, intimate sharing. So that really, what you're talking about, and it's interesting to me that you're talking about it as voice, because of course, as writers, that's that's the critical, that's the critical element, isn't it? It's the voice that you find in order to communicate. And your voice in this is very, very beautiful and very inviting. So that really came across. Was it scary?
I felt exposed.
Yeah.
But I knew, in working with the women on the ethnographies, that to go to the place of vulnerability is the place where the treasures are, where the gems are, where the wisdom is. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go for it, because look at all these people, all the doctors and nurses and grocery store delivery people. They're really out there exposing themselves, and there are real life consequences. And so in that context, it was actually quite easy to see myself as safe and privileged to be able to sit at my dining room table and work on this. And so I didn't have the pressure or the fears of how the academic community would respond. That was, something that was a concern before, but not with this book. I totally let it go, because quite frankly, I was safe. My career and my place of living would not be affected by what I wrote in this book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting because it really feels like you're kind of healing this rift too, that exists in academia that I referred to at the beginning. The fact, of treating the subject in a non-dualistic way, which is of course the basis of our practice. Our practice is such an embodied practice, and so for you to be studying and approaching the practice in so many different, from so many different angles and in so many different ways, that in itself seems like a really healing kind of endeavor. In the book, you start out by talking about a pilgrimage, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
So when I was writing and finding out how to connect the dots, I realized what I had been on was a pilgrimage, because it was a sacred journey that each person I met along the way was transmitting their wisdom to me. And so it wasn't that I self-consciously went on a pilgrimage at the beginning, but looking back, I realized that that's what it had been all along. And so to see it as a sacred journey, so I decided, yes, I will describe it as a pilgrimage, because that's what it was. And then as I was getting to the end of the book, I realized the pilgrimage continues, and that we're all pilgrims. Once I started seeing everybody as a pilgrim on their own journey, that then to see their Buddha nature, to see the world in this way, is very powerful, potent, and helps me still to get through the day looking out. Now the news is full of war, and to see each person as being on a sacred journey. And so I don't go into despair. Not that the pain is not there, but that I'm not giving up on humanity.
Well, it was interesting too. You talk about pilgrimage, and I mean, in a way, that's what you're describing too, because you were talking about that moment early on when your mother died and your son had just been born. And so, I mean, there's the birth and death, the pilgrimage that we're all on, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll start with after I'd already decided I was going to work on healing rituals, I met this Zen master who I'd known from before in Japan, actually at the nunnery in Nagoya. And he said, I snuck back to the Shoin, the place where he takes his rests, because I was not allowed back there, but I thought this is my one chance. So I knew him outside of the nunnery, so I knew it was going to be okay with him. So I slipped in and asked him what how do you heal? And he said, the beginning of healing is death. You must take that as your point of departure. And so I scribbled my notes afterwards, but I can't say I understood for at least 10 years. And then, as you note, living in that space between the birth of my son and the dying of my mother, right in the middle of it, I was just too focused on taking care of people's needs. But reflecting back, I thought when Kakuzen Roshi is his name, that was the key to understanding what he meant. Mm-hmm. When I finally had time to reflect on it, that having my mother being closer and closer to death is how I was healing from what would soon be the loss of her and my son growing up without her. And it helped me see that death is not the end. I'd heard that and intellectually kind of understood, but it became a palpable reality that death is a radical transformation. But as some of the women, after years of working with them in the Bringing Zen Home book, admitted that they had a closer relationship with their mother after she passed. And because there wasn't the limitation of the body that, as one woman described it, when she wanted her mother, when her mother was alive, as an adult woman, it was like, oh, she's across town, I've got to go get to her or go call her to be near her. But after she passed away, anywhere she was, her mother was with her. And so the power of death to heal in an everyday way is what I realized. Oh, this is what Kakuzen Roshi was getting at, as he was at that time facing a terminal diagnosis. And his Dharma talks during that period were incandescent. He's a big Dogen scholar, and sometimes his Dharma talks can be very complicated and hard to understand. But during that period, they were just incandescent wisdom, just like directly transmitted into people's hearts. And I thought, oh, something's happened. And it was, now I see, he understood that death is where you begin healing.
Well, that's really, I mean, that's such a profound and profoundly true teaching. I think, of course, the sort of origin story of Buddhism is that, isn't it? It's sickness, old age, and death, and the realization of sickness, old age, and death sort of setting you out on this path. I mean, that was certainly the case for me when it was really when my father was sick, and I was taking care of him and doing a terrible job. That really, sort of made me realize I need something. I can't do this without some kind of foundation, somewhere to sit, some way of being with this, right? And certainly by the time my mom died, I'd been practicing, for several years, and had that kind of a little bit more of a ritual foundation, be that in sitting practice, but also in informal Zen practice. That really helped me sit upright through this time of tremendous grief and tremendous pain. So I really, that part of the book, when you sort of describe this, I found that very, very moving. I also found it was interesting to me too, because, of course, we have this in common too. We're both mixed race, Hapa Japanese American women with, with Japanese mothers. And I know my mother, was, she was a piece of work. And when I grew up, I wasn't speaking, I didn't speak Japanese. And it was really only when I learned to speak Japanese, which happened much later on in college, that I suddenly felt this connection with my mother that I'd never seen that part of her before. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that. I think you had a similar experience, right?
Yes. So I could understand her English, which was very Japanese pronunciation and grammar intact, because I grew up with it. But it wasn't until college, likewise, that I learned to speak Japanese well enough or understand Japanese well enough that, she read Chaucer and War and Peace and Shakespeare, and I never knew that growing up, because her English did not allow her to say what she had understood. And so we also, speaking Japanese, I could be the kind of daughter that she could relate to more naturally, I want to say, because English was not her native language. And, I could speak circles around her in English, and which I did as a way to, get things I wanted. And, so it was not it wasn't like I wanted to share my secrets with her, because we didn't have a common enough language for that. Although I knew that she totally loved me. That was never in question. But once I learned to speak Japanese and started learning what she was made of, that was transformative for our relationship. We became very, very close. And I am so grateful that I had the opportunity to learn Japanese, live in Japan long enough to be able to have an entirely different relationship with her. And no matter how old I got, if we start out in English, it was the old dynamics were not as smooth. And then we switched to Japanese, and then there was this warmth and openness. And she could care for me in a way that I could feel, and that was what she had wanted to offer me, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think you point this out early on in the book, which this was I think the first moment. It's on page 3 where I just I kind of did a double take. But you were talking about about learning to speak Japanese, and that Japanese, you say, became a portal through which the nuance of my mother's knowledge and complexity of her thought came alive. And then you talk about how that you came to see language as an infinitely flexible form of ritual activity that creates and connects worlds. And this is something that really intrigued me, because of course, as a writer, language is perhaps, in a way, it's the ritual that I perform, and that we all do, but it's a ritual that I prize and perform, and it's beloved. It's probably the most intimate daily ritual that I perform with tremendous gratitude. And I've always thought about language as being a kind of ritual, something that is passed down from the ancestors through the lineage of us. And it helps. I mean, it helps. It creates culture, and it creates community. And as you're pointing out, it creates the intimacy in relationships between, between parent and child, or between all of us, right? So this was something that I thought was just very, very beautiful. I thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I in trying to explain ritual, I broke it down to, oh, it's meaning making activity. And of course, words are ways that we try to express meaning as well. And then when you look at different cultures, we see how there are these different worlds that get opened up. Like in Japanese, a parent, there's no verb that a parent can use to express "I love you" to a child. And my father, white Western man, would say "I love you" all the time, and my mother never said it. And then I later read something how this is a phenomenon among Asian Americans, that their parents don't say they love them. And because there's no verb, and because the assumption is that love is an action, not something you express verbally. But when she first told me in English that she loved me, I was actually about to go to Japan, back in the days when you could be sent off right at the gate of the plane. And I felt like I was good. I could fly to Japan all on my own, with just my arms. I was just so moved to hear that, because I'd grown up in these two worlds where hearing the word "I love you" from a parent meant something. And that at some point, I guess, decided that that was something that she could say to me in English. And so it was like this meeting of these two cultures that she was living in and that I was living in. And so the power of one word stayed with me. That was when I was 14. So I didn't have the words back then to talk about language as ritual and meaning making. But later I reflected how it matters what we say. It matters how we understand each other's deeper assumptions about the nature of reality. And rituals are all about creating meaning and constructing reality.
Wow, that is, again, that just kind of blew my mind, because I'm reflecting back on my own childhood and realizing that you're absolutely right. My mother never said "I love you." That was just not part of her vocabulary. And it was never anything that I actively missed, simply because she showed me in other ways. But now to think about that, and to think about how easily my father was able to say that, but how my mother never could, that's really interesting. Yeah, wow, that just sort of shifted my whole my whole sort of view of the way that I grew up. Oh, look at that. Who's this?
This is Aki.
Oh.
She's deprived of running around, so she's here with me.
Nice. I always think pets on Zoom are welcome. Wow. Well, that's really interesting. And just to kind of pick up on this a little bit, when I've been thinking about sort of my relationship with ritual, and realizing that it's actually been a little bit, it's an uncomfortable relationship that I've had with ritual over the years. Very often seeing ritual as being something kind of externally, imposed on me in order to make me conform to something that I'm not. you know, yeah, a kind of an expression of a hegemonic power of, religious institutions, for example, and certainly in Zen, there's so much, formality, and the Zen forms are, very strict and very prescribed, and the ceremonial components, are can be pretty intense, right? And so I've always had a bit of a relationship with it, which is a problem because I'm a priest, right? And so I have to hold these, right? And it's really taken me a long time to to feel, and I think the way you describe it is at home, right? To feel that kind of at home quality, that kind of intimacy with with these rituals. And I guess just to sort of shift it back to this idea of the way we grow up, right? I When I was growing up, I think probably because I was coming from a mixed race background, I never felt that the rituals that we were performing as a family, and it was a very nuclear family, just the three of us, were really authentic. Like the Christmas and the Thanksgiving, those kinds of rituals didn't quite feel authentic because it wasn't like the kids in the neighborhood. They did it very differently. My mother was never comfortable cooking turkeys. She didn't like ovens. She liked to cook everything on the stovetop. That didn't. And so and then she also didn't really raise me with any Japanese rituals that I could think of. So in any case, I guess I was just wondering how did you navigate that when you were growing up? Did you have rituals as a family that you felt really grounded in and comfortable in, either from your mother's side or your father's side?
Yeah, so my mom, I look at her and see she loved ritual. She thrived in ritual. Like um you know, she embraced doing all the Western rituals, Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas, and she was very good with making things with her hands. So, our house was always filled with all these beautiful things for each of the holidays. And I realized for her that she was embracing her new home in the US. She came when she was in her about 34, comes over to the US, to Detroit. And that was just her personality. And I didn't realize, though, how much she had also raised me with Japanese ritualistic sensibilities and aesthetics. She did flower arranging and sewed kimono. And because of being raised in Detroit, where there were really no other Japanese, to get soy sauce, my parents drove to Chicago, 6 hours back then, but one way to get soy sauce. And here in the US, not that long after the war, World War II, she felt pressure for having her children be seen as an example of how a Japanese mother raises her children. And so the whole culture was up for judgment in her mind. So she raised us, later she confessed, much more strictly than she would have if we had been in Japan, or perhaps even in a community where there were other Japanese. She felt the pressure was all on her. And so I didn't discover that until I found it was natural for me to be working with Japanese women in Japan who were in their 70s and 80s, and I'm in my 30s, because that was the culture she had instilled into the home. And so they were my people. And the people my own age were it was different. I didn't understand that culture. It was the older women, even older than my mother. Because her sense was tradition, older, to be strict, she needs to go back to an earlier time. So, like Meiji style behavior. And so who knew that that was going to turn into how I was able to work with these women and get access to this part of the culture that has been changing very rapidly. And they're the ones who helped me see that the skill to generate rituals that are tailored to the specific needs, that they're the ones who taught me that's what they're doing. And yes, they live in the very top-down heavy Japanese culture. They know it so well that they know also that they need a way to be with their lives that are outside of that pressure and those expectations, which can be stifling, painful. Even I would even say there's okay, I won't say that right now, but so they found a way to get their deepest needs met by creating rituals in their own homes, using this repertoire. Japanese culture is rich with repertoire for rituals, but they had this freedom to just take this and that and weave things together to get their own personal needs met. And in my mom's own way, that's what she was doing. It's with jack-o'-lanterns and Christmas trees, because that's what she had to work with in the US. But it was that same impulse to work with what you've got, to create that safety, to create that space where you can breathe and be at home.
That my mind is going off into several directions, but I guess the first thing that I want to just point out is that you're sitting in front of your home butsudan, right?
Yes.
And so so am I. Different, but it and the other thing I was thinking, of course, when you're talking about the flexibility to create your own ritual, I was remembering in the book you describe a beautiful ritual that you did with your son Kenji when he was I think 15, right? When he was just coming of age. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just read from the book this story.
Great.
And it all happened at this altar right behind me. And I'm sorry I can't get a clear view of the kannon, Senju kannon, thousand-arm kannon that is in the Butsudan. But that is one Kenji had decided when he was a bit younger that he wanted that image. And I thought, okay. And to the left and right, you can see the black tabs. Those are the tablets. Those are the memorial tablets. The ihai for my mother and father are in there. So this altar is part of our family because it was just mostly me and Kenji growing up while Kenji was growing up. But it didn't feel so lonely because my parents were always there with us. Okay, so the story begins, despite all the currents competing for Kenji's 13-year-old attention, I decided I was not helpless. I could do something to balance the forces pressing in on him via technological portals, advertisements, YouTube, and engines that search in places he would not otherwise have even known exist. When he was a child, we had done the traditional Shinto rite for acknowledging his full entry into the human realm, and I realized we needed another rite to welcome him into the realm of being a teenager in the digital age. Lacking a tradition for this, I invented my own. The day he got his first cell phone, he went to our home altar. With seriousness of intent, he mindfully sat centered in front of Kannon, left hand raised in a half gassho to indicate respect. He bowed slightly as he lit the candle and incense. He then intoned the bell and kept the beat with the wooden mokugyo as he chanted the Heart Sutra. 18 being Kannon's auspicious number, I prepared 18 cards in which he would write down 18 qualities he intended to cultivate as a teenager. When I was designing the ritual, I had almost made a major mistake that would have resulted in a significantly different event. I was going to write the 18 qualities I thought he should cultivate to navigate the period of growing up. I left the cards blank just in time for him to start making his own decisions about what kind of person he wanted to be. Upon completing the writing of each card, he used 2 hands to place it on the altar, rang the bell, and stood up to make a full prostration. With forehead to floor, palms raised upward, he vowed to cultivate understanding. He quietly reached for another card, thoughtfully wrote, mindfully rang, confidently stood, respectfully bowed, and vowed to cultivate wisdom. Solemnly, he repeated the ritualized motions in turn, vowing to cultivate determination, forgiveness, generosity, courage, balance, strength, kindness, helpfulness, loving, compassion, bravery, caring, and gratitude. Although these were all qualities I would have chosen myself, I was getting a little nervous at this point. There were only 2 more to go, and I had so wanted him to be conscious about being accountable for his actions. As if he could hear me think, he wrote the 17th card. But before ringing the bell, he looked my way. This was his first break in ritual form. An impish grin flashed. Ring, stand, bow. I vow to cultivate responsibility. He knew it would be more poignant to have that one toward the end. Though relieved his conscientiousness was active, I seriously scoured my mind, wanting to be sure there was not some vital quality he might miss. Though I vowed about my tongue and let him do all the choosing, I was internally in a fluster, worrying about what vital quality must be included. With gravity weighing heavily in the air, he took the final card. It was sinking in that if I had mandated the qualities he would have to commit to before receiving a cell phone, I would have lost this incredible opportunity for him to demonstrate his growth and for me to find out who my son was. He wrote extra slowly. With focused attention, he placed the card on the altar. A round peal of the bell filled the room. Moving deliberately, he arose for his 18th full prostration. Palms lifted in a gesture of ultimate respect, he managed a monotone as he uttered his final vow. I vow to not forget to be playful. Which is the lesson I needed to learn most.
So he became your teacher in that moment.
Yes, he totally did. We're still working on that one, but
that is such a beautiful story. It really is, and it highlights something, especially as you were reading it. What I was thinking I was thinking about the artistry in ritual, and I was thinking about the dramaturgy, right? and and how important that is, and how he clearly, your son clearly had a sense of that, right?
Yes.
um and in your book too, you talk about beauty, right, and the importance of beautifying.
Mhm.
And so I think that's part of it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I just think that's such a all of the rituals that you describe in the book were so beautiful. They were so moving because they're so beautiful. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, when I realized that seeing something in its deepest beauty required me to see it in the biggest context I could possibly imagine. And anything in the context of the universe becomes beautiful, because without it, then we aren't who we are. The world isn't what it is. And um, yes, there is violence and there are terrible things, injustices going on. But most people actually throughout history have lived with kindness and warmth and support. We wouldn't be alive if it hadn't have been for all the myriads of ways in which we have been nurtured. And so to see the beauty in something is a very, I want to say, concrete way to experience healing. That to see something in its beauty means you are seeing the causes and conditions and the relationships, which, because we're alive, are relationships that are in a fundamental way, I'll use the word love. They're so when you look through eyes of love, you see beauty. And when you see beauty, you can love more readily, more deeply. And so that was something in 2020 hindsight, looking at the way my mother lived her life, that, it was not easy being a Japanese woman who cannot speak English well. Everyone wondered what language she spoke. Um, and in Detroit with the riots, and then moving to the suburbs with the racism, and being the target of it we moved to Dearborn, which was the world headquarters of the Ford Motor Company. And the auto industry in the 80s was undergoing some adjustments to the fact of Japanese cars being more reliable. And so my mom became the target of the animosity. And so she had a lot of reason to see the ugly. She'd been through World War II. I mean, all along, it was easy to see the ugly. But she kept choosing to see the beauty and creating beauty in little ways, how to arrange the food on the plate, and, how to even hold the plate, how to set the plate down, how to pass a cup to someone. All of that was just how I saw later, or now I see, that was all a way of creating this beautiful motion in our bodies, in our lives, in the way we interact. And if you've got a choice, why wouldn't you want? I mean, don't we all want that kind of smooth flow, welcoming flow in life? And she just kept choosing that, and helped me start seeing the beauty everywhere too.
Listening to this, I'm thinking about the little things, the way that and I hadn't really thought about these as ritual, but I think they are a form of ritual that I just unconsciously picked up from my mother. You talked about handing, when you hand an object, you hand an object with two hands, right? And it's funny. Do you know the story Uniqlo?
No.
Okay, Uniqlo is like a big Japanese chain store that's
Right.
really popular here in
Yeah.
America now.
Yeah.
And but it's just it's just like a, clothing store, right?
Right. Right.
And the American cashiers, right? The people who are manning the cashiers are trained to hand you the receipt with two hands. Right. So it's so funny because you go in and there are these young Americans who are handing you, handing you your sales receipt with two hands. I always thought it was kind of beautiful and very touching to me. But with my mother too, all of these very, very small, things that she did or didn't do, like you would never use your foot to move an object on the floor, right? And or to close a cabinet or something like that. To use your foot would just, and this is so ingrained, but I was never taught that. It was just, that was just the way, that was just the way we were. And so this idea of action, right? That ritual is something that we perform with our bodies. We practice it with our bodies, and it's a way of moving through the world. I think is very beautiful. And I noticed that in the book, the first couple of chapters, well, the first chapter is offering, and then garden the heart, home is refuge. And then from there, you have a series of chapters: cook, clean, flow, relate, be, nurse, grow, grieve, beautify, and harmonize. And they're all verbs.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just an interesting and very, telling choice. I'd love to hear you talk about how that came to be and how you sort of found your way to structure the book in this particular way.
Yeah. So ritual is embodied action, embodied meaning making action. And I wanted to underscore how daily life is ripe with opportunities to turn everything into a healing ritual. It doesn't have to be you step out of your daily life, but you can transform your daily life to live in this mode or to generate this mode. And there's nothing too small or insignificant to not be worthy of giving it the respect of its place in our lives. So respect is in Japanese society, it's an embodied expression. You can't have just respect in your heart. You have to bow, you have to use the two hands. It actually comes out of Confucian view of things, but that it must be expressed with the body. You cannot, there isn't the body-mind split. And the notion that your body cannot lie. Martha Graham, a dancer, also makes that observation that the body does not lie. Well, that's just the foundation of Japanese cultural instincts. What someone does with their body tells you what they really care about, what they really value. Because anyone can sound wonderful and polite, and Japanese has made it a total art out of speaking politely. And so, it gets a little more involved, but there is a concept of self that's what you perform, engage in publicly.
Talk about this. I think this is so interesting. Yeah, honne and tatemae.
Right.
Yeah.
So
describe this. I think this is so important. Yeah.
So, tatemai is how Japanese society flows so smoothly for the large part. I've heard so many people have been traveling around the world. They get to Japan, they're like, oh my God, it is so nice to be here, where people are so polite and helpful, and people are sincere when they are helping. And there is a sense that your honne, the core self, that you don't need to express it to everyone. There are places where that's appropriate. So if you've had a hard day, or you're angry about something, or any number of negative afflictive emotions, you don't put that in your tatemai, in your public self, because it's that relationship or that interchange is not about processing what you're going through. It's about respecting that person, that moment, and what's appropriate for that relationship in that time. And there is no sense of being duplicitous, or that you're being insincere. It's actually, you are sincerely caring about the person in that moment, in public. And then it's in private, where you've got maybe other things to process that you do with maybe in silence and quiet, and with no one around, or with people with whom the relationship is sufficiently deep or complex or involved that you could have that part become open in that context. So that, to me, is a ritualized mode of living, where you perform the tatemai, the public self, and you even perform the private honne self. Because if in your honne private self you are acting like the tatemai self, the way it comes off is you're being cold and you're distant and you're not letting someone in. So there is a very different quality about these selves, but people can jump back and forth between these two depending on the relationship and the context. And I think I just appreciate that way of being.
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't actually connected. I hadn't actually connected tatemai with or either. I mean, both, right, with the ritualized behavior. But of course, you're absolutely right, and that is such an interesting way to think about it. In a Western context, of course, people would think, oh, that's so hypocritical, right? That's, as you say, duplicitous, right? But, we have, in the West, we just have such a kind of monolithic view of, or kind of fundamentalist view of truth being an absolute, right? And so tatemai would be duplicitous and deceitful, right? It would be it would be something that those inscrutable Japanese do, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that you're taking that and reframing it in such a beautifully articulate way as ritual, and then of course it becomes something that is quite profound and quite meaningful. Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. I remember being in, because it is the way that we experience the world. I think it's certainly the way I experience the world. And maybe, maybe this is also partly growing up as a mixed race person, because there were always multiple sides. There was, truth wasn't uniform in that way, right? And so when I first came across this notion of honne and tatemai, I remember feeling such a sense of relief, like, oh, right, of course, this is just a description of, things as they are in their, multiplicitous form.
Mhm.
It's sort of like the Sandokai teaching in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's really great. I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions, because I'm sure people do have questions. But I wanted to just take a moment here to before we open it up for questions to talk about, or to actually to ask you to talk about the last chapter in the book, which is the chapter called Harmonize. And in a way that this last chapter, I thought, brought together all of the elements. I mean, it really brought all of the elements of the book into this beautiful kind of harmony. And the way you're thinking about harmony seems to me to be very expansive and, again, many dimensional. And the metaphor that you use is a musical metaphor, which I learned too, that you play the violin. And so I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about harmony and sort of bring in that beautiful metaphor.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. It was one that I struggled with most in terms of how to articulate. It's easy to talk about, oh, we all want to get along, we all want to belong. But remember, I'm writing this when violence and hatred is all over the streets in the US and beyond. And so I thought harmonizing means all the elements work together in a way that's beautiful. But I thought violence and hatred are not beautiful. And so I finally realized the way to understand myself and to articulate it is through drawing on what happens, a phenomenon. It's a real phenomenon, sympathetic vibration, that when a violin has E, A, D, G strings. And so if you're playing the D on the A string, the D string, you're not touching the D string, but the D will vibrate when it's in tune, because that raw physics of vibration, when that's the sympathetic vibration, when two things are at the same frequency, they activate each other. And you can, if you're really in tune, the instrument's in tune with itself and you are in tune playing it, you don't just get the octave, you get the fifth and you get the third. And that's why people like Isaac Stern and Pinky Zuckerman just sound so beautiful. And also why my violin teacher encouraged me in college to go on to Buddhist studies for graduate school, because I wasn't hitting everything so perfectly. But that was my key to understanding when you are literally in tune with the vibrations in the universe, then things ring. But if you're out of tune, the three poisons are being out of tune. Hatred, violence, those are being out of tune. And so they won't make the harmony ring. And so that's how I understood, yes, you want to include everyone at the table. You want everyone to be healed. But, just like Augustine says, hate the sin and not the sinner. That an act of compassion is concrete, first of all. And it is only an act of compassion, which is defined as being based on wisdom, non-dual wisdom in the Buddhist context, when you play that in perfect pitch, when your act is perfectly in tune, meeting the need, the exact need, then there's healing, then there's everything harmonizes. And so I thought, yes, that's the kind of harmony. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of practice, a lot of listening, and it's a way to accept and be open, but not loosey-goosey, anything goes. It's not that. Love can be fierce, and it needs to be the precise action to pull out the Buddha nature, to make the Buddha nature ring, to use Buddhist language. So that's how I understand harmonizing, as finding that act that meets the need with non-dual wisdom and that helps ameliorate suffering.
And that just, the story that you told about Kenji, that you read to us about Kenji, it just strikes me that, and you said this, that if you had written those, that would have been slightly out of sync, right?
Yeah, I would have been pushing
Right.
Myself when it was about him finding his way. And so that it would have been an abuse of power.
Right.
Yeah.
And I love the way that this metaphor brings out the notion of practice, and the idea that, yes, I mean, this is Dogen's question, right? If I already have Buddha nature, if I have original Buddha nature, why do I need to sit zazen, right? Why do I need to practice? And this is the answer, right? Because you need to find that right, that right action, right, to that right place on the fret, to make it sing. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love to invite people to if anybody has any questions or any observations, perhaps Helena, you could sort of orchestrate this.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So, what we'll do is go ahead, and if you have a question, feel free to either raise your virtual hand, which is under the reactions button at the bottom. If you click on that, you'll get this raise hand bar at the bottom of that little pop-up screen, or you can actually put it in the chat, and I'll read out your question out loud for you if you didn't want to share yourself, or you kind of camera shy. So you're welcome to do either of those. And if you don't want to do that, you can kind of raise your real hand and I'll keep an eye out for you, and we'll just go from there.
And while we're waiting for people to think, I'd just like to ask one more, or just make one more kind of observation. The first time I read this book, I have to admit, I was skimming it, right? Because I had been asked to write an endorsement, a blurb for it, right? And so I was skimming it quite quickly. And still, I mean, I thought my endorsement was actually quite good and very accurate. I wrote, "It's a gift that distills wisdom, kindness, and care to heal ourselves and those we love," which I think is exactly right. When I knew that we were going to have this conversation, I went back and started reading it again, and found myself reading it very, very slowly. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful experience to read it that way. It felt a little bit like, Lectio Divina. And so I just wanted to kind of say this, like this idea of sacred reading. And I just wanted to say this because if people have read the book, I think it would be it's a wonderful way the book almost invites you to read that way. And now I do see that Melissa has her hand up. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for all of your words, which have really sunk in. I too am a Hapa, daughter of Japanese mother, and I have a very fraught relationship with her. And I think that one of the things that I'm struggling most deeply with right now is belonging, because of my biracialness. And I didn't know that, but I'm a avid reader of both of yours, and I did not know that you were a hapa. And I'm just maybe curious, if you could speak a little to how you interact with belonging and not belonging. I felt like I've not belonged my whole life everywhere I've been. And I'm realizing in my 40s that that has really colored a lot of my choices, the desire to belong. And I guess I'm just curious about if you have any words of wisdom. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry you don't feel like you belong, but you can belong to those of us who have that feeling. I when growing up in elementary school, I was in a region that was like 98% Black. And shockingly, sometimes I was saved from being treated harshly because the Black kids knew I wasn't all white. The white kids had no clue. And then when I moved to an all-white neighborhood in junior high and high school, they thought I was Chinese something. And so I was never seen for who I was. And when I went to Japan, I was so sad that the Japaneseness in me wasn't seen. And also my name was Paula Robinson, my father's name, family name. And so in graduate school, I went to the judge and got my name changed, put my mom's family name, because people kept asking me, why is a Paula Robinson studying Japanese Buddhism? And I thought it's because this patriarchal practice ritual of, taking the husband's name. And so the judge actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was surprised. It was the liberal part of the country. And he even asked, what does your father think? And this is what my father actually said was, he's happy he raised a daughter who could think for herself. And, but for me, after training in the nunnery, where my Japanese was fit in, and I could move my body in ways that didn't broadcast I'm an outsider. And it wasn't until some elder woman in the kitchen, lay woman, was helping out with a big event. And she was saying something to me, and I didn't know that word. And so I had to ask her. And then her stunning reaction that I wasn't born and raised in Japan, I could totally let go of not being seen anywhere after that, because it was like I passed. And so for me, that aching to belong was as soon as someone saw that part of me that had been so unseen in a deep way, saw it, I was okay with just being myself. And that's not a method that can be repeated, I don't think. But for me, I carried that loneliness. And I was at the time like 29. And I will say after that, I notice when people are treating me in part because of my background, maybe treating me with a little less respect. And in some ways, it's maybe it's part race, but gender as well. And so I've had to work on that too, but the gender side. But so I don't know. I grew up with nobody mixed around me. in Detroit, that it wasn't a thing. Coming now, I live on the West Coast, and I still find it surprising to meet people, and I feel a kinship that I had never grown up with before, with all these Hapa people. Yeah.
I also really, I hear you. I was born 11 years after the end of World War II. Most of the fathers of my friends had fought in the war. And so, and there was a lot of real serious, deeply ingrained prejudice at that time. And all of the, I grew up on the East Coast in an area where there were no Asian Americans at all. 98% white. And people saw me as being Japanese. They saw me as being a little Japanese girl. And so that's, of course, what I thought I was, right? I thought that I was exactly what, because I was taking on the projection. But I didn't know anything really about Japan, except the little bit that I would learn from, osmosis from my mother. So I felt fraudulent as a Japanese person. I certainly didn't feel like, like a white Caucasian American either, and nobody saw me that way. And so there was I knew very clearly what I was allowed to be as a Japanese girl. I had to be quiet. I had to be studious. I had to be serious. I could play a musical instrument. I had to be good at math. There was a kind of, I took on all the stereotypes, right? And it was only when I went to Japan, and this was the big, I think, healing thing for me too, was going to Japan and having people see me as an American for the first time. And I realized then that, oh, wait a minute. You mean I can be loud and obnoxious and raucous, and I can have a sense of humor, and it's all okay? Sure, because you're American, And that was a real liberating moment for me. And, little by little. So I think part of it was just exploring both halves, exploring the parts really quite deeply. I too learned Japanese, and that was hugely important for me, just to kind of understand and get in touch with, and to heal the relationship with my mother, which again, I was able to do when I learned to speak the language. So that was a big part of it. But the other part of it was when I really started writing seriously. And that was the first time that I really understood that rather than being in the middle of the mainstream culture, it's better to be on the outside because the view is better. You can see more from the outside than you can if you're right in the middle, because that's all you can see. Whereas, I have a much broader, much wider perspective, precisely because I don't fit in anywhere, right? I've learned to move around and be a little bit more agile. And so I guess that was another part of it, was turning what had been a source of pain into something that was very empowering. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
So we have a question from the chat. Would you please speak to how you are now using ritual, love of canon, and so on right now in our world, in times of more war, ever increasing hatred, etc., with deep gratitude?
So coming to my altar is a place where I can be reminded that there is wisdom and compassion flowing in our world. For me, chanting the Heart Sutra literally helps my body vibrate in tune with that bigger context, even if I can't intellectually comprehend. I can feel it in my bones, knowing there is more than what meets the eye. I've just started offering sutra copying practices to different sanghas. And that very embodied practice, yes, Zazen is very powerful, but sometimes when the mind and the heart is so distracted by all the negativity that's so on the surface, that getting your body to calm down, copying, in this case, it's usually the Heart Sutra, but copying it gets you back to the present moment, and you can touch that part of you that is connected. So those practices keep me from despair. They keep me in the present that has all these very horrific things going on, but it keeps me from losing perspective. That I like to think of healing as what happens in between the ideals of like Buddha nature and cessation of suffering and the raw realities of our suffering. And healing is what happens in between. And so these rituals of chanting, of sutra copying, I love just sometimes ringing the bell and let that vibration of the bell get me more in tune. So that's what I do.
And I think for me, it's really the Zazen practice that I think something that's changed is that now, and maybe this has started to happen, Paula, in part because of your book, that I've become a little bit more flexible with Zazen. And instead of sitting at prescribed times, which I do, now I'll sit down at the altar just in the moment because I feel like it, right? Because I'm having a moment of, of distress, or I've read something, I've read the news, I've read something that's upset me, or I've had an interaction that's upsetting. And I think that, I don't think before I was really doing this as much, just coming here and sitting down and lighting the candle and offering a piece of incense and just sitting, even if it's just, 5 or 10 minutes in the middle of the day. I'm finding that little ritual has really helped. And so this idea of, I mean, this is how the book has really kind of opened up my own ritual practices. The idea too that you can find these little ritual moments or these opportunities to practice something in a ritualistic way opens up all sorts of possibilities. Like, for example, when you're doing the dishes, right? If you set a certain kind of intention and you wash the dishes in a certain kind of way, it becomes a supportive ritual practice instead of a chore or something on my to-do list. And so this is, I think, really a shift that's happened since reading this book. And I think this is where the book becomes such a healing, it becomes such a source of healing. So thank you.